Hey, what is up, guys? Welcome back to the Watcast. My name is Quentin and this is Josh, but you guys already knew that. Last week, Josh had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Melton about hospitality, and that was awesome. Oh, it was so great. I definitely learned a lot of stuff from that one. And this week, we're going to do something a little bit different. And I don't really know what it is. So, because they don't tell me things. Josh, would you like to go into what we're going to be doing?
Super excited for what's going on today. We're just going to be able to sit Q and I in a space where we get to look back and reflect on the things that we've been learning as we've been engaging in these conversations with some just really cool, really wise and insightful guests that we've had the privilege of talking with. We've been learning a lot, and we're just going to take this time to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been learning, some of what we have taken away, and then a small glimpse into what might be going on next semester a little bit. And so we'll talk through those things, and we have a special guest with us today to help us along the way, someone that has been just incredible behind the scenes this entire semester. Our producer, Caleb Hitchcock. Welcome in with me.
We're going to have Caleb on the show.
Big facts, bro.
Oh my gosh.
Well, welcome to the 11th episode of the Watcast. I am actually your host today, Caleb Hitchcock, and with me, as always, are guests, but you know them as your host, Josh and Q. Thank you guys for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us, man.
Thanks for taking the time to be here. You know,
what
always
is happening?
Absolutely.
Q, I know you didn't know what was going on today, but I'm here. So checks and balances.
We're doing this on camera.
Don't say anything ridiculous.
You got it, boss.
Anyway, I have been going along this journey with these two guys all semester. They call me a producer, and that's just because I wanted to be called a producer. I haven't been doing much. These guys have been absolutely killing this semester, just reaching students in a unique way that they didn't know how they were going to do it, right? We entered the semester being limited with what we could do and how we could gather and what that would look like, and you guys figured it out, and you did something fun that you would enjoy that would also reach students. And so you guys have been just so faithful to put something out weekly, and it's been awesome. For those of you guys who have joined us these last 10 weeks, this is 11, for this, there's been some incredible conversations, incredible content that you guys have just put forward for people to hear. And I know you guys just, at the beginning, was like, let's just try this. And it just panned out and it worked out. And I think the Lord was in that, and just some incredible conversations that, if nothing else, you guys have been changed by this process. But we hope that obviously the men and women in Watson Hall have been changed. And as we all know, this has been a broader reach than just Watson and broader reach than just PBA. But people outside of our community have enjoyed this. And so we just want to look at this semester in review. So Watcast episode 11, the Watcast, a semester in review. Let's hear some thoughts. So my first question for you guys is, as you think back on the semesters, you think back on how this got started, as what your initial ideas were and how this panned out. What have you guys learned? What have been some thoughts that have really struck a chord with you, that have sat with you all semester as you look back at different episodes, as you guys sharing your own stories? So let's start with you guys just telling your story. Like, what did that look like? How did that feel to do that digitally, just with each other, but knowing that other people would be hearing it and being vulnerable to a camera instead of a crowd? What was that like?
Yeah, I've had many chances to get to sit down with people and share my story, but I do remember like that feeling weird to think like, well, this is now going to be out on the internet for any old bystander to just stumble upon in the YouTube algorithm. And like I remember there being like a series of people that like reached out to me who had heard it that I'd known from like years ago, or different things that I like would never have thought they would have heard this story. Not that I wouldn't have wanted them to, it just was super random. Like I remember this guy, his name is Scott Bartelt. And in my story, I shared about my mission trip in Ecuador when I first felt like the Lord had been moving me toward a life in ministry. And so I'm sharing about this time in Ecuador. A couple weeks later, I get a text from Scott Bartelt, who was somebody that was on this trip with me as a leader with the high school ministry of Crew. And he reached out and he was like, "Yeah, I just watched the episode with my kids, and just so grateful to have been a part of that journey with you." And so that was really cool. My buddy Blake that I talked about in my story reached out to my mom, actually, which I think is funny. But just so many people from even my life that like have reached out and been like, "Oh man, like it was such a cool thing to see where you've been, and see like the moments that they were a part of my story, and see and hear like where I'm sort of at right now."
Right.
It was just a cool thing that like I never would have thought came from it, but it came from the fact that it was just out there on the internet.
Yeah.
And being sent all over the place. And so tons of people got a chance to listen in.
Yeah. And Q, you, as you mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago, Gabe was a significant part of your story. And then we all got to hear from him and got to hear some of that, some of his wisdom and his experience and being shared with you. Or being shared with us. What was that like to have him on? Also, just sharing your story, and anybody in your life kind of reach out after that episode, and anything strike a chord with them?
Yeah. So this definitely is not the first time that I've told my story in front of people, but this is the first time that it's been online, which is a new thing. But I think the people who saw my episode that were new were just folks in my family, because I didn't tell them about all the crazy stuff that I've been through. I didn't know how they were going to react. Quite frankly, I was terrified. But all my friends and things knew, so they were just like, "Yeah, that's just like we know, and we still love you." But when I showed my parents, they really didn't know what to think. But they did say that a lot of stuff began making sense, because from my teenage years, they just saw me like change and didn't know why. But now, given context of why I was such a sporadic little demon child, they were like, "Oh yeah, we get it. We understand." And like, "Hey, if you want to talk further into it, please let us know, because we love you and want to see you grow, even though the things that happened were so long ago." And they're also proud of where I've come, because that takes a lot. It takes a lot of God. It takes a lot of grit and fortitude to kind of pull yourself out of that hole. So that's kind of all, as far as reaching out goes. But it's really all I could, or more than I could ever ask for.
Right.
I'm not really somebody who cares too much about other people's opinions, except for my parents, because I want to make them proud. Yeah. And I think I'm doing a good job in that so far. Yeah. So. Yeah.
But what a beautiful thing to get to, right? This whole idea of sharing story, as you guys dove into a little bit more with Kelsey and Dr. Maxwell. It spurs on conversation. It spurs on moments of closure and of clarity and of healing. And and I think that's incredible. That testimony, in a way, breeds testimony of God's faithfulness and in that. And so let's move forward a little bit. Anything for you guys that just really sat with you, even as you guys were thinking? I mean, I know it was less you wanted to share your story, to be, vulnerable with your audience, and them get to hear a part of your life. But that naturally, obviously, we had to plan it all, right? To move into a conversation about story and how that plays out. And so what are those things that are takeaways from you, either sitting with your guests or the thing that you really wanted our residents to leave with?
There's a lot of things that kind of, a lot of main points, and by a lot, I mean like 3. But they're good ones. So I would say one main point that came up a lot, beginning with Kel's episode, talking about just story and kind of knowing oneself, would be that, to know yourself. Because we can kind of go numb to our own reality as far as how we're just coasting through it. And with that, we can kind of become accustomed to the bad things and still not know how to cope. And this is where things like compliancy and anxiety and depression come in, where it's just you're at a super low, but you're just kind of hanging out there in that ditch because you really don't know what to do. And like, this is just Tuesday. This is my sad day. But yeah, it's really up to knowing when you need to rest or when you work the best, or that was not meaning to rhyme. Anyway, second would be definitely the importance of story, and to just understand that everyone has their own. We've talked to a lot of people on this show, Josh and I, and each one has their own story, and I've come away from multiple perspectives of life. And like, last I checked, there's like 7.86 or whatever billion people on the planet, which is a lot of people considering that 3 of them are sitting in this room right now, separated by plexiglass. But it's
nice COVID plug.
Oh yeah, for sure. Shout out to COVID. Please go away. We don't like you. No one likes you.
The shout outs.
Yeah, but lastly, to kind of bring this question home, knowing other people, or at least like understanding just how cool and insane it is that there are so many people on this planet that have their own story, that are almost like all completely different. They're like snowflakes, right? Like we all heard in grade school, like the teacher would be like, kids, the snowflake, there's never any one that's this like the other. It's something like that. I don't know.
I grew up in Florida.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. So for our non-Floridians that have never even seen a snow.
I got the concept though.
Okay. Seen a snow.
Yeah. Shout out to Virginia. We get snow sometimes. Yeah. So just understanding that like there's so many people in the world, and there's so many people on this campus as well that just have each their own different stories and their own different experiences. One of the more important things is to understand. Oh gosh, no, this is not a good time to be forgetting things. To understand,
okay, we can edit it out.
Yeah, I'll say my backup one. To understand God and how He works in people and what. Oh. Yes, I remember now. Don't cut any of this out. It's great.
Great.
When it comes to understanding God and understanding yourself, our episode with Gary Witherall, which is, go watch that. He talked about being a message of love to those outside. And that's kind of like what the whole mission part of missions is, even though that word has been used up so many times now. It's such a simple concept, but often so very overlooked. When we are in our day-to-day lives as Christians, we are by default always ministering to others by being the representation of Christ. And you don't really have to even try super hard all the time to like get Jesus across to anyone. You just have to be a good person to kind of reflect Christ's love in normal conversation, of course. Now, when it comes to like Bible study and stuff like that, then you crack out the good book. But but just in like normal conversation, just day-to-day things, you are automatically a beacon of Jesus. So
You are a letter.
yeah, you're a letter.
You're a
So
letter.
no pressure, but
So know yourself, know others, know God. You are a letter.
yeah, it's just kind of like putting all the stuff together, actually, and then much like a letter.
Yeah,
Oh my
much
gosh.
like a letter. So Josh, what about you? What about your interview with Dr. Maxwell?
Yeah. Man, that feels like a lifetime ago.
It was.
It was such an incredible conversation, and just to see how it has even just played out throughout my semester in just a number of ways. So talked with Dr. Maxwell about this idea of story, right? And about like moving from understanding our own story and recognizing our own story toward the biblical story, and understanding the biblical story in light of our story, and then circling that back around to sort of then better understanding our own story in light of the biblical story. And one of the things that came up in that conversation was this idea of like freedom to play with the text and with the biblical story, and to realize that these are people, these are real stories of people that have their own story that goes on separate from like their small little episode that comes and goes throughout the text, right? And so all those things affect the way we ought to understand and tell the story. And I love that idea because it helps us see our place in that story, because our place in that story also isn't just this sort of episodic thing. It's a full cohesive narrative that is being played out, and our full cohesive narrative is a part of a larger narrative that's at play. And so that sort of launched some thinking for me around this idea of story and understanding my own story. And I think that the point of knowing others is important, and recognizing that everybody has this sort of mass story, and they're all intertwined with each other, and we connect with other people's stories in a variety of ways. But I have also been doing some research this semester with Dr. Grenz into this idea of calling and understanding our calling as believers. And one thing that we were moved to, Dr. Grenz and I, in research and in conversation with one another, and in just understanding our calling better, is this connection between our calling and God's story at work in the world, and how, in order to understand our calling, we have to understand God's story. And we recognize that our calling comes out of that. And in the same way that everybody has a story, everybody is called in some way, and our stories impact the way that we're called. We so often get fixed on this idea that we believe that we're all going to be called to this like one specific thing, this one specific moment, this
Right.
like one place.
Like a covenant.
Right. Yeah.
Like a, yeah.
But the reality is, like the rest of our story, our calling is dynamic.
Yeah.
It's constantly developing. It's constantly changing as our giftings are developed, as our passions are sort of become more narrow and specific and directed, and as we accumulate experiences, and as our story continues to unfold, our calling and our role within God's story continues to change and move. And there's freedom in that, in the same way that there's freedom to play with this text that Dr. Maxwell talked about. There's freedom to play with our story as we are seeking direction from the Lord and calling in our own life. And I think that was just a huge thing throughout this semester that has come up that really, I think my conversation with Dr. Maxwell sort of kickstarted.
Yeah, that freedom is so important because I used the word covenant because I think of Abraham. I think of like a specific calling on his life that he had, that we read that text and we read our own life through that as if there is a story like that for us that God is calling us to. And if we don't find that we failed him.
Yeah.
But in reality, there is that freedom and that grace to understand the reality that there is a general calling that all have been given. And that's, for me, in the way I've always shared is simply it's live in obedience. God has made his desire for us and to do kingdom work with him very simply, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And we lose sight of that because there's so many stories that we walk alongside where it looks like, oh man, their calling is so cool, and I want that, and it's we put such a high demand on ourselves that we don't need to.
Yeah.
That it becomes a chain, and it holds us back instead of frees us, for sure.
Yeah. I know this is sort of a side note, but I know like my sister was actually on my trip to Ecuador with me. She came also, and I remember there being this sort of frustration from her a little bit that I was called and she didn't feel like she had this specific call, and it left her like wondering like, well, what about me? Like, what am I supposed to do? And she's worked through that incredibly and is now off doing amazing things. She's in South Korea teaching English. But I remember that being like this sort of frustrating thing of like trying to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
And that struggle comes from, like you said, that idea of like, we all have this like specific thing. And the reality is maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah. So getting into Q's second wheelhouse, mentioning Ecuador, South Korea, international missions. And it's interesting that many of the guests that you guys had on the semester were experientially fluent in more than one culture. And there's a lot in there, and a lot I kind of want to pull out specifically from you, Q, having been a GPC the last 2 years and a DA the last 2 years.
Yep.
I want to dive into culture. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on Krista and Caleb and Gary and Dr. Faircloth shared as it relates to culture. And I think one of the specific things within that is again, calling. Like, you see these amazing people who have done these incredible things, have grown up in different cultures, have given away a lot of comfort and convenience to go on mission. But the last 2 years, Q, this on mission has looked really different. Or at least the expectation has not met the reality of what it's been due to COVID. And so you've worked through as a part of simply on the planning side, but also on the practical side of this. And so what does that look like for for campus missions and as a GPC, and for our student body, students who are looking forward to going and being obedient to this calling that they have to go serve internationally somewhere, and that's end up looking very different.
So, oh gosh, where to begin? Because we've really had to do a lot of different things with this whole COVID situation and missions, which is fine, and I'll explain why. So, when it comes to being, I'm going to call missions global service from now on. Yeah. When being in global service, it's important to understand that you have to be flexible and also have a spirit of steadfastness. And I I'm pretty sure, even when going through what we've been going through before even getting out there and into the world, has taught us and the leaders that we're mentoring so many things as far as exercising those traits. So last year, we didn't really have any trips happen because of COVID. And now this year, we're cutting back a lot on that as well, even more so. Which is disheartening, yes, but at the same time, it does teach a lesson. And every corner that you turn where there is adversity, God is teaching a lesson.
Shout out to episode 10.
Yeah, shout out to episode 10. We found that out rather early. I don't know, 9, 8, 7. I don't gotta watch. I'm in them. Gabe. Facts. Yeah, but it's important to have that spiritual steadfastness and that ability in just relentless will to serve wherever you are. Because, like, let me just say, you don't have to go bajillion miles away to go do global service. You can do global service in your own backyard. And I know you probably heard that before, talking to you peeps at home. But it's true. Heck, for our Watson residents, you can minister to your roommate. You can minister to your suite mate. You can minister to your neighbor. You can minister to somebody on another floor. You can minister to somebody in your class. Just anyone other than you. Just so long as you're not like sitting in a mirror saying like,
you should preach the gospel to yourself every day.
It's good to practice. Yeah, but if you're just talking to anyone, dude, it's like, you're good. Don't worry.
So what would you say to the idea, though, that you could argue while it might be more difficult circumstances, it's a little bit easier to minister to a group you've never met?
Absolutely.
And it's a little bit more of a challenge, right, to be on mission, to do global service in your room to people who, after the fact, after you leave that short-term thing,
those people are going to see you again. Yeah. In that situation, you're absolutely correct. By the way, when it comes to global service, like you're going to meet these people groups and it's going to be great, but unless you go back the next year, you might never see them again. So you can do what you're going to do and be like, I did the Jesus thing, and then pretend you did something. But when it comes to ministering to those in your room, it's a little bit weird because you are going to see them again. You do live with these people. But here's what I'd say to that when it comes to like, oh, am I saying the right thing? Or is it even right to say this now? Or I don't know, some other third thing that's holding you back. Just make sure that you're doing it from, like the root of your action and the root of your speak is from love. And also make sure you know what you're talking about. That'll be important as well. It's just the truth. But just make sure you're doing it from love and make sure that you kind of have them understand that as well. Because you can think that you're doing something from love and you end up hurting them even more than they already are. And you're still here thinking like, I'm on my Jesus high. Like I did a good thing for God. And now your roommate hates God even more because you wanted to go be a Bible thrower. So make sure that you're doing this in kind of a double layer of love, just to make sure that your roommate understands, or whoever you're ministering to here understands that, yes, you care about them, and yes, like, I want to tell you about these things, and I want to have this conversation with you, but at the end of the day, like, you're my neighbor, you're my brother or my sister in Christ, and I still do love you, just like God does. But yeah, that's a good question as well, because we do know that there are people on campus that are rather shaky in their faith, or in a completely different faith, or in no faith at all. And I guess it's important for them to know that though they're in a completely different environment where they, quite frankly, are outnumbered as far as beliefs go. They're still loved and they're not singled out. They're still PBA selfish. They're still fam. And I hope that I'm not the only one that shares this ideal.
Yeah. I think it's global service, amazing, beautiful, go do it. But there's a big difference between a week or a month of faithful action and a lifetime of faithfulness where you are.
Absolutely.
And that's truly what we're called to wake up every day and be faithful. And Josh, you sat down with Dr. Faircloth and with Caleb, and you yourself in your own story, very familiar with the idea of culture, in which Dr. Faircloth really reframed even for us in that. What were some takeaways for you?
It's just so much. The big thing that I'll say alongside Q is this idea of I love the pairing of flexibility and steadfastness, because a lot of times flexibility feels like stopping and maneuvering and moving, but steadfastness is different than stopping. It's maneuvering along the way. This idea of I'm still on mission, even though things are changing, even though things are hard. The vision that God has for creation and that God has for the world remains the same. And so my role in the season might look a little bit different because of circumstances and change that's going on around, but the ministry that I'm a part of alongside Christ remains the same. And I think that one thing that becomes so cool that I see from the conversation with Dr. Faircloth is just the way he sort of defined culture as a society's pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. I love that idea. I love that thought. And I love that society is everywhere. And everywhere, in every context, there's some kind of pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And even understanding other cultures different from us is seeking to understand what is good and true and beautiful about that culture. When so often we think about differing cultures, our mind immediately goes to, well, what are all the negative differences between us? And so this whole idea of culture being the pursuit of something good, true, and beautiful, I think changes the way we understand our own culture and the way we interact and understand other cultures. And I think it's incredible to recognize that, as Q is saying, global service is not just in other countries. We are a part of the globe. We are a part of what is global. And I think one thing that Gary said in his episode when he was sitting down with Q and talking is this idea that here in West Palm Beach, Florida, we are at the ends of the earth. This is the ends of the earth. And so we are very much a part of global service here and now. And this idea of you almost don't need the word global there. It's just service, wherever you happen to be, wherever your circumstances have placed you, wherever the Lord has moved you. You're called to service there and with the people there. And another thing that came up with Dr. Faircloth that you talked about a little bit just now is this idea of when we're sitting with people, wherever it is that we may be, whether it is globally or in our own room with our roommate, right? These sorts of conversations and loving people has to happen in a way that they're going to see it as out of love. And I think one thing that Dr. Faircloth talked about is this idea of saving face in Thailand. Whereas here, he talked about like when we're making a point, we get loud, we emphasize certain things, we might make an argument and bring up things that might refute us and then argue those things, and we lean in, all these things. We make our presence wider, right, when we're getting serious, when we're making a point. But he brought up this idea that in Thailand you don't do that, right? You have to sit and know the culture and know the person that you're sitting with in such a way that you can speak to them in a way that they're going to hear what you're saying. And I think that goes for action as well. We have to act and behave in certain ways towards people, not losing our own integrity of who we are, but just in a way that loves them as who they are, and speaks to them as who they are. And I think it's one of my favorite things I've been learning this semester is at Pentecost, right? You have the message being preached and heard in the languages of others, right? And so this idea that the power of the Holy Spirit at work in us should move us to the cultures of others, and to be able to communicate this message, this incredible message that we have in such a way that it's going to be heard by the people that we're sitting with, wherever that may be, whenever that may be. And I think, like, my conversation with Caleb, we had a blast. It was so fun to sit down with him and just talk about India. We didn't plan on talking about India as much as we did in that episode, but there was just so much good and richness to the culture. And I think that for me, like, India was the place that I spent the most time in outside of the States. And so I feel like, probably other than Japan, but that's because I'm constantly learning about Japan. India is probably a culture I'm more familiar with than others, and there's a deep love that comes out of that familiarity. And I think that goes into even Kelsey's conversation and in conversation with Dr. Maxwell is this idea of really truly getting to know people and getting to know who they are, becoming familiar with them, the things that make them the way they are, their stories. You begin to love them more. And that takes time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I was literally just thinking of that idea of knowing yourself, knowing your motives, walking into a moment of reflecting Christ, being an ambassador in whatever situation you're in, knowing the person, their story, how they receive love. Because there's a beautiful thing in the idea of even the fact that you could disagree with somebody and still walking away loving and appreciating who they are, right? Like, even culturally, we can disagree on what we see as beautiful and lovely and good in even how we pursue those things, right? Because American culture and India's culture look very different in those pursuits. But knowing ourselves, knowing them, and knowing God and His mission, His desire for every individual, through story is one of the greatest ways that we can reach culture. Which, all in all, I don't know if you guys planned that, but like, that's a beautiful transition. And then another beautiful point as it relates to culture is Dr. Faircloth spoke before Krista and Caleb got the chance to speak, but Krista and Caleb both shared about how they almost feel no belonging to a culture, having been in such a multicultural context growing up. But he made in episode 5, before they spoke, the idea that that's what the kingdom looks like, is a multicultural belonging, which is beautiful.
So you guys just hold tight. You're getting there. You're just ahead of all of us.
Yeah. All right. So let's move toward wrapping up this semester. And so we got to hear from Gabe Hajar, who I actually went to high school with, as well as his sister, and also felt that homeschool story coming into high school and needing, sensing that sense of adversity, not to the degree that he and his family did, obviously, but adversity as a whole, we culturally are really in a moment of adversity, and we all are facing it in our own way. And I'm just wondering, have you had some thoughts that have come out of that conversation you had with Gabe as it relates to being a student and what the lesson to be learned, not that we're going to discover it all right now, but what would have been some of your reflections since that time?
Yeah. When it comes to being a student, because there are multiple ways to tackle adversity from multiple angles. Like there's not one specific adversity. So I guess I'll talk about the one that's probably going to hit the same for all of us as students. When it comes to being overwhelmed in studies or not knowing what to do for your exam or your project or what have you, or having social problems, or I don't know, any of the college things, I guess you can say. Something that I've definitely learned from talking with Gabriel is just to understand that it's okay to do like a hard stop as far as your life goes. Just to take a forced step back so that you can relax and breathe and reevaluate. Key emphasis on breathe and reevaluate, because it feels like some of us are at a point where we cannot breathe with all the stuff that we have going on. That's a testimony to myself, because I'm doing a whole lot of things right now. But in light of that, don't be afraid to just stop and figure things out before continuing forward. And understand that it's gonna be all right. Like something that I often remind myself of is that God made the universe, and the universe is really, really, really big compared to just the planet, like planet Earth. So everything that happens in this lifetime is just so feeble and so small. And if you fall short, it doesn't matter. Just so long. Sorry. I'm not getting emotional, I promise. I'm choking on water. In light of falling short in adversity, it's important to kind of remember to get back up and just keep moving forward. Either that, or take a step back and set a plan for when you decide to keep moving forward. The main theme is to eventually get back on that horse and keep moving forward. So,
man, a universe analogy from a guy with the NASA shirt.
Yep.
Love it.
Now we're talking about horses.
Well, it's interesting, Q. We had talked, the three of us talked last week about a common thread that you guys saw is almost that step back, mentioning things like our culture's love of efficiency, and that pushes back on the idea of pausing, and in a way, Brittany talked about it a little bit last week. And so I do want to dive into that, Josh, as far as it refers to hospitality. And want to know, I think we could literally have spent a whole episode reflecting on Brittany's episode on hospitality, and likely the number one, maybe not important topic for our building, but for our staff. Josh and Q serving within Res Life, a big part of a big word that you could really compare our role to is hospitality, right?
Yeah.
In a way, that's what we do. We oversee housing, right? But the big conversation there being that's the facade of what hospitality requires. And that is hard to wrestle with for our staff, wanting and desiring to invite residents into our spaces and love on them in a way where they feel a sense of belonging, where they are spending time with us. And so I think the word that I loved that Brittany compared hospitality to was interruptibility.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, being a planner, being a type A person, it's a lot easier for me to plan, to clean my house and to make it nice and to host something that I've spent time planning. And it's a lot easier to do that than it is to allow someone to just knock on my door at any time of the day when it's not ready, it's not set, and just be present with them. So give me some of your thoughts on just what that interview was like for you and some of the things that stick out, and even that idea of interruptibility of for our residents that can't host other people on campus in their rooms, even though they finally has this space where they can feel like it's theirs and it's like a real home, because it doesn't quite look like a dorm room. It looks like an apartment. And so what have some of your thoughts been about all that? Yeah,
I was going to say that I think one of the big things that we on campus, in living in halls and apartments is that like one way that we're experiencing adversity is not being able to have people in our space in a safe and a comfortable way, like we may be used to. And so one thing that came out of this conversation with Brittany, is this idea of hospitality, like true good hospitality requiring some sort of rootedness, right? And I think we so often, as Dr. Melton and I talked, believe, trick ourselves into believing that rootedness has to be to a physical space. But the reality is that rootedness, that allows us to feel the freedom to be ourselves and freedom to grow, that comes from hospitality, is a rootedness in people, right? And it's people that give us that space, right? And so I think that goes a lot with this idea of interruptibility, in that it's not necessarily just my space that allows me to be hospitable, or that allows me to experience the hospitality of others. It's the people. And so I can be hospitable without the space. And I can experience hospitality without being in another's space. And so that idea moves hospitality out of my room, out of my living room, and into the sidewalk walking down South Olive, or the hallways in between classes, or in the caf, or in the library. All of these spaces become places of hospitality when experienced in the presence of other people. And so I think that has become something that I've been learning a lot this semester, being in a role that seeks to facilitate spiritual life and conversation. Would have loved to be able to have 20 people in my apartment to hang out and just have conversation, and to learn and pray and just experience the presence of the Lord together.
What Q did last year,
Yeah, exactly. And the reality is, just because that isn't an option, right, doesn't mean that hospitality isn't. Right. And so learning what hospitality looks like, separate from that physical space, and more towards the presence of people. And so,
and I think, sorry, I was thinking, just as you guys were talking, the idea of Jesus being the most hospitable and being homeless, and comparing, and even you talking about rooting, like Jesus is the vine, right? And like that analogy fits so well in there. And then Mary and Martha, and that idea of you can be a hostess and not be a hospitable, and you can be a guest in someone else's home and be the most hospitable person. Which is what Jesus was, for sure.
Absolutely.
Again, we could dive into this forever, and maybe it's worth another episode next semester for. Speaking of next semester, you guys, I know, are hoping to continue the Watcast, have some great things for everyone to look forward to next semester, so they will tune in sometime in January. Thank you guys so much for joining us this semester on the Watcast. It has been an incredibly fun thing and a joy for these guys to do, I know, and they have just worked so hard. I hope you guys know how much these guys have desired to serve you and have put in hours upon hours serving you. Josh doing tons of editing and bringing on guests, and Q designing logo, bringing on guests, and working simultaneously alongside the GPCs in that co-ministry with us. So thank you guys for joining us on episode 11. That wraps up the fall semester of the Watcast.
Yep,
See you in January.
It. Everyone stop watching now. Watcast! This is... That was terrible.